I came home from burying my husband to find new locks on the door. Nora Blake needs her room for her home office now. Grief doesn't pay rent, Evelyn said coldly through the door. My kids stood crying in the pouring rain when my mother opened the door and literally kicked my children into the mud, screaming, "Get your pathetic spawn off our property. We don't want your misery contaminating our home." Harold backed her up viciously. "Widow problems aren't our problems. Figure out your own life instead of being a burden." Nora smirked with satisfaction, finally getting the space I actually deserve instead of wasting it on dead weight. I didn't argue. I just quietly took my children and within 48 hours made them regret every word. The funeral had been a blur of black dresses and whispered condolences. Ethan's casket had looked so small in that enormous church surrounded by flowers that would wilt and die just like everything else beautiful in my life. My 7-year-old daughter, Lily, had clutched my hand so tightly I thought she might break my fingers. While my 5-year-old son, Noah, had buried his face in my dress, his small body shaking with sobs. He was too young to understand. I'd moved back in with my parents 8 months ago when Ethan's cancer treatments had drained our savings. The medical bills had consumed everything we'd worked for during our 8 years of marriage. The house we'd bought together, the car payments, even the small college funds we'd started for the kids, all gone. What I didn't know at the time was that Ethan had quietly liquidated his business retirement account and a small inheritance from his grandfather before the medical bills consumed everything else. Evelyn had offered us the spare bedroom temporarily, though I should have recognized the calculating look in her eyes even then. Now, standing on the front porch of what I'd foolishly thought was still my childhood home, I felt the first drops of October rain beginning to fall. The brass key that had opened this door for 28 years of my life suddenly felt foreign in my hand. I turned it, expecting the familiar click, but instead met resistance. The lock had been changed. "Evelyn," I called, knocking on the door. "Evelyn, it's Lauren. The key isn't working." Footsteps approached from inside, but the door remained firmly closed. Through the frosted glass panel, I could see my mother's silhouette, arms crossed, feet planted wide like she was preparing for battle. "Nora needs your room for her home office now," came her voice, muffled, but unmistakably cold. "Grief doesn't pay rent, Lauren." The words hit me like ice water. "What are you talking about?" "Evelyn, please open the door. The kids are getting wet." As if summoned by my words, the rain began falling harder. Lily pressed closer to my side while Noah started whimpering, his small Superman backpack already soaked through. They'd been so brave at the funeral, so strong for their ages. But now they looked like lost puppies abandoned in a storm. The door suddenly swung open, revealing my mother's face twisted with an expression I'd never seen before, pure, undiluted contempt. Without warning, she stepped forward and literally kicked Noah, sending my baby boy stumbling backward into the mud that was rapidly forming on the lawn. "Get your pathetic spawn off our property," she screamed, her voice carrying a viciousness that made me step back in shock. "We don't want your misery contaminating our home." Noah hit the ground hard, his small body making a wet, squelching sound as he landed in the rapidly deepening puddle. Mud splashed across his face and into his mouth. He started crying. Not the normal crying of a 5-year-old, but the broken, desperate sobbing of a child whose world had just collapsed entirely. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I shouted, rushing to help Noah up from the mud. His little hands were scraped, his knees bloody through the torn fabric of his funeral pants. That's when Harold appeared behind Evelyn, his face set in the same cruel mask I was beginning to realize had always been there, hidden beneath years of polite family dinners and birthday celebrations. "Widow problems aren't our problems," he said, his voice carrying the authority he'd always used to end arguments when I was a child. "Figure out your own life instead of being a burden, Lauren. We raised you already. We're not raising your kids, too." Behind them both, I could see Nora lounging on the couch that used to be in the living room, now apparently relocated to what had been my bedroom just this morning. My sister had always been the golden child, the one who'd graduated summa cum laude from law school while I'd settled for nursing school and marriage to a man who fixed cars for a living. But the expression on her face as she watched my children cry in the rain was something beyond typical sibling rivalry. "Finally getting the space I actually deserve," Nora said with a smirk that made my blood run cold instead of wasting it on dead weight. For a moment, I stood there in the pouring rain holding my traumatized children and felt something inside me break. Not the way my heart had broken when Ethan died, or the way my spirit had cracked under months of medical bills and sleepless nights in hospital chairs. This was different. This was the sound of every last bridge burning, every last thread of family loyalty snapping like overstretched rubber bands. I could have screamed. I could have begged. I could have thrown myself at their feet and pleaded for mercy, for basic human decency, for the love I thought they owed me simply by virtue of sharing DNA. Instead, I did something that surprised me. I smiled. "Okay," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the rain. "I understand." I picked up Noah, feeling a small body shiver against mine, and took Lily's hand. We walked to my car, Ethan's car, really, the last thing that hadn't been repossessed, and I buckled them into their car seats with hands that had stopped shaking. "Mommy, where are we going?" Lily asked, her voice small and confused. "Somewhere safe," I told her. And for the first time in months, I meant it. As I drove away from my parents' house, I caught Nora's face in my rearview mirror. She was standing in the doorway now, probably making sure we were really leaving. The smirk was still there, but I thought I saw something else, too. Maybe just a flicker of uncertainty, like she wasn't entirely sure what she just unleashed. She should have been uncertain. She should have been terrified because Nora had made a critical error in her assessment of the situation. She'd assumed that grief had made me weak, that desperation had made me helpless. She'd looked at a widow with 2 small children and seen easy prey, dead weight to be discarded. What she failed to consider was that I'd spent the last 8 years married to Ethan Walsh, the finest man I'd ever known, and more relevantly the smartest financial planner in 3 counties. Ethan had taught me things about money, about legal structures, about the intricate web of modern finance that most people never learned. He'd made me his business partner and more than just in name had insisted I understand every aspect of our financial life. More importantly, Nora had forgotten what I did for a living. Nursing wasn't just about bedpans and blood pressure cuffs. I'd spent 15 years working in the ICU, dealing with families in crisis, learning to read people's darkest moments, understanding how desperation made people vulnerable. I'd seen what happened when people's carefully constructed lives fell apart, and I'd learned to navigate those treacherous waters. But there was something else Nora didn't know, something I'd kept private out of respect for Ethan's memory. 3 months before he died, when we both knew the cancer was going to win, he pulled me aside and handed me an envelope sealed with wax. "Don't open this until you absolutely have to," he'd said, his voice already weakened by the chemotherapy. "But when the time comes, you'll know what to do with what's inside." That envelope was currently tucked into my purse, still unopened. I'd carried it to his funeral. Through the weeks of settling his affairs, through the humiliation of moving back in with my parents, I'd been waiting for the right moment, the moment when I'd absolutely have to use whatever Ethan had left me. Nora kicking my children into the mud qualified as that moment. I drove to the Comfort Inn on Highway 9, the only place I could afford for more than a night or two. After checking in and getting the kids settled with a few possessions we'd managed to grab, I sat on the edge of the bed and finally opened Ethan's envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address, a phone number, and a short note in Ethan's careful handwriting. "Lauren, if you're reading this, things have gone very wrong. The person at this address has been waiting to hear from you. Tell them I said it's time to collect. I love you. Ethan." The address was for a small office building downtown, the kind of place that housed insurance agents and tax preparers. The name on the note was simply Mitchell. I'd never heard Ethan mention anyone named Mitchell, but then again, my husband had been a man who kept his cards close to his chest. I'd learned over the years not to question his methods, especially when it came to money. Ethan had a gift for seeing 3 moves ahead in any financial game. The next morning, after dropping the kids at the emergency daycare program at the local YMCA, I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could work up the courage to drive to the address Ethan had given me. The kids had asked so many questions over breakfast. Where were we going to live? Why couldn't we go back to Grandma's house? When would Daddy come back? And I'd had no answers for any of them. Lily had been particularly upset, refusing to eat her cereal and asking repeatedly why Grandma Nora had been so mean. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally simply don't? How do you tell a child that family isn't always the safe harbor you've taught them it should be? Noah had been even worse in his own way. He'd gone completely silent, his usual chatter replaced by a vacant stare that reminded me too much of the way Ethan had looked during his worst days in the hospital. When I tried to help him brush his teeth, he'd flinched away from my touch like he expected to be hurt again. The drive across town gave me time to think, to really process what had happened. In 24 hours, I'd gone from being a grieving widow with at least the promise of family support to being completely alone with 2 traumatized children and rapidly dwindling resources. The motel room was costing me $60 a night, money I couldn't afford to spend for more than a few days. I'd spent most of the night awake, doing math in my head. With Ethan's remaining life insurance payout still tied up in bureaucratic red tape, I had maybe $800 in my checking account. After the motel, gas, and basic necessities for the kids, that would last us perhaps 2 weeks if I was careful. I'd already called the hospital where I worked, hoping to pick up extra shifts, but they gently reminded me that I was still on bereavement leave and shouldn't rush back too quickly. The building was older but well-maintained with a small brass plaque next to the door that read Mitchell and Associates, Private Investigations. Private Investigations. My dead husband had apparently had dealings with a private investigator. The office was small but professional, all dark wood and leather chairs. The man behind the desk was maybe 60 with steel gray hair and a kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen everything at least twice. "You must be Lauren," he said before I could introduce myself. "Ethan said you'd come eventually, though I hoped it would be under better circumstances." "Please sit down." I sat, feeling off balance and more than a little confused. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell, but I don't understand. How did you know my husband?" Mitchell opened a file cabinet behind his desk and pulled out a thick folder. "Ethan hired me about 2 years ago to conduct what he called insurance investigations into your family members. He was very specific about what he wanted me to find and very patient about waiting for the right time to use the information. He laid the folder on the desk between us, but didn't open it yet. Ethan was convinced that if something happened to him, your family would try to take advantage of your grief. He wanted to make sure you had options if they did." My heart started beating faster. "What kind of options?" Mitchell opened the folder, revealing what looked like hundreds of pages of documents, photographs, and printed emails. "Let's start with your sister Nora, shall we?" For the next hour, Mitchell walked me through what could only be described as a complete breakdown of my family's secrets. Nora, it turned out, had been embezzling from her law firm for the past 3 years, skimming money from client settlement accounts in amounts small enough to avoid detection, but large enough to fund her lavish lifestyle. The evidence was meticulous: bank records, expense reports, even photographs of purchases that couldn't possibly be afforded on her salary. But that was just the beginning. My father, Harold, who'd always presented himself as a model citizen and pillar of the community, had been running a cash-only side business repairing cars damaged in insurance fraud schemes. The garage behind their house, which I'd always assumed was just Harold's hobby space, was actually a sophisticated operation for altering VIN numbers and hiding accident damage. And my mother, Evelyn, sweet church-going mom who'd never missed a Sunday service in 40 years, had been systematically defrauding the elderly clients of her house-cleaning business, using her access to their homes to copy personal information and make small charges to their credit cards. "How did Ethan know to look for this?" I asked, feeling dizzy from the revelations. Mitchell smiled grimly. "He didn't initially. He just asked me to look for anything that might give you leverage if you needed it. Turns out your family members are remarkably careless about covering their tracks." He pulled out another set of documents. But here's the interesting part. When Ethan first came to me, he wasn't planning to expose any of this. He just wanted insurance information he could use to protect you if necessary. But about 6 months ago, he came back with a different request. Mitchell opened to a new section of the file revealing what looked like corporate documents and bank statements. He asked me to set up a very specific kind of legal trap. If your family ever tried to throw you out or deny you support, the trap would spring automatically. I stared at the documents, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. What kind of trap? Mitchell leaned back in his chair, and I could see something that looked almost like admiration in his eyes. Your husband was one of the most thorough men I've ever worked with, Lauren. When he came to me with this plan, I thought he was being paranoid. But Ethan insisted that he knew your family better than you did, and that if anything happened to him, they'd show their true colors eventually. He pulled out a timeline chart that looked like something from a detective movie. 8 months ago, Ethan started monitoring your parents' financial situation very carefully. He knew they were struggling. Your father's legitimate auto repair business was losing money to the chain stores. Your mother's cleaning service was barely breaking even, and Nora's lifestyle was costing far more than a junior associate's salary should support. I felt a chill run down my spine. He never mentioned any of this to me. He didn't want to worry you while you were dealing with his illness, Mitchell explained. But he was watching, and he saw the signs. Your parents took out that second mortgage to pay for Nora's law school, but they also used it to cover some of your father's business debts. When Ethan realized they were going to default, he liquidated his retirement accounts and a small inheritance to fund the shell corporation, Riverside Holdings LLC, and arranged for it to purchase their debt from the bank when the time came. Mitchell spread out more documents showing a complex web of financial transactions that made my head spin. The beautiful part is that it was all completely legal. Ethan used the last of his liquid assets, money that would have gone to medical bills anyway, to set up this safety net for you and the children. The kind that turns their own greed against them, Mitchell continued. Ethan set up a shell corporation and used it to purchase the mortgage on your parents' house. As of 6 months ago, Lauren, you own the deed to their property. They've been paying rent to you without knowing it. The implications hit me like a physical blow. That's impossible. They've owned that house for 30 years. They owned it, Mitchell corrected, until they took out a second mortgage to pay for Nora's law school loans and your father's business expansion. When they defaulted on payments 4 months ago, which Ethan somehow predicted they would, the shell corporation bought the debt from the bank. They'd been making payments to a property management company that Ethan set up, never realizing the money was going into an account controlled by you. I sat back in my chair, feeling dizzy. But why didn't he tell me any of this? Mitchell's expression softened slightly. Because he hoped he'd never have to, Lauren. Ethan's plan was always meant to be a last resort. He kept hoping that your family would prove him wrong, that they'd support you when you needed them most. The house was meant to be your insurance policy, not your weapon. He pulled out another set of documents, these ones showing bank statements and payment records. Look at this timeline. 4 months ago, when your parents first missed their mortgage payment, Ethan could have foreclosed immediately. But he instructed the property management company to offer them a payment plan instead, giving them every opportunity to keep their home. He only wanted the leverage, not the destruction. I traced my finger along the payment schedule, seeing months of extensions and grace periods that Ethan had apparently authorized without my knowledge. He was protecting them, too. He was protecting everyone, Mitchell agreed. But he also knew that if push came to shove, you'd need more than just moral authority to fight back. Your family strikes me as the type of people who respect power more than principle. As if to prove his point, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Nora. Stop being dramatic and come pick up your stuff. Evelyn's having chest pains, and you're stressing her out. I showed the message to Mitchell, who read it and shook his head. Even now, they're trying to manipulate you. Your mother's chest pains are probably just anxiety from realizing they've lost control of the situation. How do you know that? Mitchell opened another section of the file, revealing what looked like documentation of her frequent emergency room visits. Because I've been monitoring all of their activities for 2 years, remember? Based on public records and witness statements from neighbors, your mother goes to the emergency room claiming chest pains every time she's under stress. She's done it 17 times in the past 2 years, always when she's facing consequences for something she's done. It's become a pattern that even the hospital staff have noticed. The casual way he said it, like having someone's medical history was perfectly normal, made me realize just how thorough Ethan's preparations had been. What else do you know about them? Mitchell smiled grimly. Everything, Lauren, absolutely everything. He slid a set of keys across the desk. Ethan's instructions were very clear. If they ever threw you out, you were to wait exactly 48 hours, then exercise your rights as the property owner, but he also left specific instructions about how to handle each of them individually. Mitchell opened to a new page revealing what looked like psychological profiles. Nora is a narcissist who's never faced real consequences for her actions. She responds to power and authority, but only when she believes the person has more leverage than she does. Your father, Harold, is a bully who spent his life intimidating people weaker than himself, but he'll fold immediately when faced with someone who can't be intimidated. And your mother, Evelyn, he paused, consulting his notes. Your mother is a manipulator who uses guilt and fake vulnerability to control people. She's the most dangerous of the three because she's the most subtle. I thought about the way Evelyn had looked at me through that glass door, the cold calculation in her eyes that I'd never seen before. She knew exactly what she was doing when she had Nora kick the kids out. Of course, she did. Ethan predicted she'd use your grief as a weakness to exploit. That's why his plan was designed to turn their own tactics against them. Mitchell pulled out yet another document, this one bearing official seals and signatures. When you exercise your rights as property owner, you won't just be evicting them. You'll be exposing the fact that they've been living in a house they no longer own while treating the actual owner, you, like garbage. The irony will be obvious to everyone in their social circle. For the first time since Ethan's death, I felt something that might have been hope stirring in my chest. What do I need to do? I picked up the keys with hands that had started shaking again. But this time it wasn't from grief or desperation. It was from the sudden, overwhelming realization that Ethan had left me something far more valuable than money. He left me justice. There's more, Mitchell continued. The evidence of their illegal activities has been compiled into packages and prepared for delivery to the appropriate authorities. The State Bar Association for Nora, the IRS for Harold, and local police for Evelyn. Ethan's instructions were that if they forced you out, all 3 packages would be delivered simultaneously, 48 hours after your eviction. I looked at my watch. It had been exactly 48 hours since Nora had kicked my children into the mud. Before I could answer, Mitchell was already reaching for his phone. First, we need to coordinate with the sheriff's department. Ethan arranged for a specific deputy, Officer Johnson, to handle the eviction. He's been briefed on the situation and is standing by. Ethan arranged for a sheriff's deputy? I asked, feeling increasingly amazed by my husband's foresight. Officer Johnson lost his own father to cancer last year, Mitchell explained. Ethan met him at the hospital during one of his treatments. When Ethan explained what he was planning, Johnson volunteered to help. He's seen too many families turn on each other during medical crises. Mitchell dialed the number from memory. Johnson, it's Mitchell. Mrs. Walsh is here, and she's ready to exercise her property rights. Yes, 48 hours ago exactly. We'll meet you there in an hour. As he hung up, I felt the last of my hesitation disappear. Ethan hadn't just left me a way to fight back. He'd left me an army of people who believed in protecting families from predators, even when those predators shared the same DNA. There's one more thing, Mitchell said, his voice becoming more serious. Ethan left specific instructions about your children. He was worried about the psychological impact of seeing their grandparents arrested, so he arranged for alternative care during the confrontation. He handed me another piece of paper with an address. This is the home of Dr. Patricia Williams, a child psychologist who specializes in family trauma. She's volunteered to watch Lily and Noah during the eviction and the arrests. Ethan met her during his treatment and thought she'd be perfect for helping the kids process what they've been through. I stared at the address, feeling tears start to form for the first time since the funeral. Not tears of grief this time, but tears of gratitude for a man who'd somehow managed to think of everything, even while dying. He really did love us, didn't he? More than you'll ever know, Mitchell said softly. But Lauren, you need to understand something. What we're about to do will destroy your relationship with your family permanently. Once we expose their crimes and evict them from their home, there's no going back. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? I thought about Noah's face when Nora had kicked him into the mud, about Lily asking why her grandmother didn't love her anymore, about the years of subtle cruelty and manipulation I'd somehow convinced myself was normal family behavior. Yes, I said without hesitation. I'm certain. What do you need me to do? I asked. Mitchell smiled. And for the first time since Ethan's death, I felt like someone was on my side. Nothing you're not already legally entitled to do. You're going to go home, Lauren. And this time, you're going to be the one deciding who stays and who goes. An hour later, I was standing on the front porch of my parents' house again. But this time, everything was different. This time, I had a sheriff's deputy named Officer Johnson standing beside me along with Mitchell and a locksmith named Ray, who was already working on changing the locks back. But before we'd arrived here, I'd made a stop that Ethan had specifically requested in his final instructions. Dr. Patricia Williams lived in a beautiful craftsman-style house about 10 minutes from my parents' neighborhood. And when I'd knocked on her door, she'd opened it like she'd been waiting for me. You must be Lauren, she'd said, her voice warm and professional. Ethan told me so much about you and the children. How are you holding up? Dr. Williams was maybe 50 with kind eyes and the sort of calm presence that immediately made you feel safe. When I brought Lily and Noah to her door, both kids had been apprehensive, but she'd somehow managed to engage them in conversation about their favorite movies within minutes. Mom, do we have to stay here? Lily had asked, clinging to my hand. Just for a little while, sweetheart, I told her. Dr. Williams has some games and books, and I'll be back before dinner. Are you going to talk to Grandma Nora? Noah had asked, his voice small and uncertain. I'd knelt down to his level, looking into his eyes. I'm going to make sure that no one ever treats you badly again. Okay? Dr. Williams is going to take care of you while I handle some grown-up business. Dr. Williams had given me her card with her personal cell phone number written on the back. Call me if you need anything, Lauren. And don't worry about the children. I have experience helping kids process difficult family situations. As I drove away from her house, I felt lighter somehow, knowing that my children were in the hands of someone who understood trauma and healing rather than someone who would inflict more damage. Now standing on my parents' front porch with the full weight of the law behind me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, complete confidence in my choices. This time when I knocked on the door, I wasn't asking for permission. Sheriff's Department, Officer Johnson called out. Please open the door. The door opened to reveal my father, Harold, his face red with indignation. What the hell is this about? Officer Johnson held up the legal documents Mitchell had prepared. Sir, this is a notice of immediate eviction. You have 30 minutes to gather essential personal belongings. The property owner is exercising their right to reclaim the premises. Property owner? Harold sputtered. I own this house. I've owned it for 30 years. Actually, sir, the property is owned by Riverside Holdings LLC and has been for the past 6 months. The current owner is exercising their legal right to terminate your tenancy. I watched my father's face cycle through confusion, anger, and finally a dawning horror as he began to understand what was happening. Behind him, I could see Evelyn and Nora clustering in the hallway, their faces pale with shock. Lauren, Evelyn's voice was small, uncertain. Lauren, what's going on? I stepped forward, and for the first time in my life, I was the one with all the power in this relationship. What's going on, Evelyn? Is that I'm coming home? You have 30 minutes to get your things and leave. Nora pushed past our parents, her face twisted with rage. You can't do this. This is our house. Actually, I said calmly. It's not. It's been my house for 6 months. You've been paying me rent without knowing it. The locksmith finished his work and handed me the new keys. They felt warm in my palm, solid and real in a way that the old keys never had. This is impossible, Nora snarled. I'm a lawyer. I know property law. You can't just steal someone's house. Mitchell stepped forward, pulling out his phone. Miss Nora Blake, you might want to be more careful about making legal threats, especially considering that in approximately, he checked his watch, 14 minutes, the State Bar Association is going to receive a very interesting package about your recent financial activities. Nora's face went white. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the $127,000 you've embezzled from client settlement accounts over the past 3 years. I'm talking about the falsified expense reports, the forged signatures, and the very detailed paper trail you left behind. While Nora stood there in stunned silence, Mitchell turned to my father. And Mr. Patterson, I believe the IRS might be very interested in learning about your unreported income from your vehicle alteration business. Funny how you never declared any of that cash on your tax returns. Harold's face went from red to gray in seconds. You can't prove anything. Actually, I can prove everything: photographs, financial records, witness statements from your customers who didn't realize they were participating in insurance fraud. Mitchell smiled pleasantly. It's amazing what people will admit when they think they're just making friendly conversation. Finally, he turned to my mother, who was now clutching the doorframe for support. And Mrs. Patterson, I'm sure the elderly victims of your credit card fraud would love to know who's been making those mysterious small charges to their accounts. Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter is a detective with a fraud unit, by the way. She's been wondering who's been targeting seniors in this neighborhood. The silence that followed was deafening. My family stood frozen in the doorway, each of them realizing that their carefully hidden secrets had been exposed, that the house of cards they built was collapsing around them. 30 minutes, Officer Johnson reminded them. Essential items only. I watched them scramble to pack their things, 3 people who'd spent their lives believing they were smarter than everyone else, suddenly faced with the consequences of their own arrogance. Nora threw clothes into garbage bags with shaking hands. Harold loaded tools into the back of his truck with the mechanical movements of a man in shock. Evelyn just sat on the couch and cried. None of them tried to apologize. None of them acknowledged what they'd done to me and my children. Even now, facing complete ruin, they couldn't bring themselves to admit they'd been wrong. That was fine. I didn't need their apologies anymore. As they carried their belongings to their cars, Nora made one last attempt at defiance. You think you've won something, Lauren? You think this makes you better than us? I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that I felt nothing but pity. Nora, I'm not trying to be better than you. I'm just trying to protect my children from people who would hurt them. We're family, she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. Family doesn't kick children into mud puddles, I replied. Family doesn't throw widows out in the rain. Family doesn't call children pathetic spawn or refer to grieving people as dead weight. Nora opened her mouth to respond, but whatever she saw in my face made her close it again. She finished loading her car in silence. 28 minutes after Officer Johnson had knocked on the door, my parents and sister drove away from what had been their home for 30 years. I watched their taillights disappear around the corner, then turned to Mitchell. But before they'd left, there had been one final moment that I knew I'd remember for the rest of my life. Harold had been loading the last of his tools into his truck when he'd suddenly stopped and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been regret or maybe just recognition of how completely he'd miscalculated. Lauren, he'd said quietly. You know we never meant. Yes, you did, I'd interrupted, my voice steady and calm. You meant every word. You meant it when you called my children pathetic spawn. You meant it when you kicked Noah into the mud. You meant it when you told me that widow problems weren't your problems. You just never thought there would be consequences. He'd opened his mouth to argue, but then looked at Officer Johnson standing behind me and seemed to think better of it. Instead, he'd simply nodded once and finished loading his truck. Nora, meanwhile, had spent her final minutes in the house frantically making phone calls, trying to reach colleagues who might be able to help her explain away the evidence Mitchell had compiled. I'd watched her through the window, pacing back and forth in what used to be my bedroom, her voice rising in pitch as each call ended with disappointment. "Please," she'd said to someone on the phone, "I just need someone to verify that the transactions were legitimate." "No, I understand you can't get involved." "Fine, just forget I called." When she finally emerged from the house, her usually perfect composure had been completely shattered. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and there was a wild look in her eyes that reminded me of a cornered animal. "This isn't over, Lauren," she'd hissed as she'd walked past me. "You think you're so smart, but you have no idea what you started." "I didn't start anything, Nora," I'd replied. "I'm just finishing what you started when you decided my children were acceptable casualties in your quest for a bigger bedroom." The look of fury and frustration on her face had been almost worth the pain of the last 48 hours. For the first time in her life, Nora had encountered a problem that she couldn't lawyer her way out of, couldn't manipulate, or intimidate into submission. Evelyn had been the hardest to watch, not because I felt sorry for her, but because her performance had been so calculatedly pathetic. She'd clutched her chest dramatically as she packed, making little gasping sounds and calling weakly for Harold to help her. "I think I'm having another episode," she'd announced to no one in particular. "The stress is just too much for my heart." But I caught her eye in the mirror as she'd said it. And for just a moment, the mask had slipped. She'd seen that I wasn't buying the act anymore. That the daughter who used to rush to her side every time she claimed to be ill had been replaced by someone who understood exactly what she was doing. The woman who had kicked my children out into the rain while claiming chest pains was now trying to use those same chest pains to make me feel guilty for holding her accountable. The irony was so perfect it was almost artistic. "What happens now?" I asked Mitchell as we watched their cars disappear. "Now you decide," he said. "The evidence packages are ready to be delivered, but Ethan left that choice up to you. You can send them and watch your family face criminal charges, or you can hold on to them as insurance to make sure they never bother you again." I thought about Ethan, about the man who loved me enough to plan for my protection even after his death. I thought about my children who deserved better than the cruelty they'd witnessed. I thought about justice and mercy and the difference between the two. "Send the packages," I said. "Some lessons need to be learned the hard way." Mitchell nodded approvingly. "Ethan said you'd make the right choice, whatever that choice ended up being." That evening, I picked up Lily and Noah from daycare and brought them home, really home, to a place that was truly ours. We had pizza for dinner in the living room, something their grandmother had never allowed. And afterward, I let them jump on the beds while I called the school to change their address. "Mommy," Lily said as I was tucking her into what had been my childhood bedroom. "Are we safe now?" "Yes, sweetheart," I told her, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "We're safe now." And for the first time since Ethan's diagnosis, I meant it completely. 3 weeks later, I received 3 phone calls in a single day. The first was from Nora's former law firm, confirming that she'd been terminated and that criminal charges were being filed. The second was from the IRS, letting me know that Harold was under federal investigation for tax evasion and fraud. The third was from Detective Fisher, no relation to my late husband, Ethan Walsh, informing me that Evelyn had been arrested for elder abuse and financial exploitation. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, but I felt no guilt either. They'd made their choices long before I'd made mine. A month after that, I received a different kind of phone call. It was from the life insurance company that had initially delayed Ethan's claim, citing complicated paperwork due to his business assets and the shell corporation he'd established. Apparently, they'd finally completed their investigation and determined that all of Ethan's financial arrangements had been completely legitimate. The check that arrived 3 days later was for $800,000, enough to pay off Ethan's remaining medical bills, set up college funds for the kids, and still have enough left over to live comfortably while I figured out what came next. There was a note included with the check, handwritten on the insurance company's letterhead. Mrs. Walsh, your husband was a remarkable man who planned carefully for his family's future. We apologize for the delay in processing this complex claim. Our condolences for your loss. That night, I sat in the garden behind my house, and thought about the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, I'd been a desperate woman watching her husband die, facing financial ruin and the prospect of raising 2 children alone. I'd been weak, vulnerable, completely at the mercy of people I trusted to love me. Now I was a homeowner with money in the bank, a woman who'd learned that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who think they know you best. I'd learned that grief doesn't make you weak. It clarifies what really matters. And I'd learned that love, real love, finds ways to protect you even after death. The house was quiet around me, filled with the peaceful silence of a place where children could be children, where no one would be called names or kicked into mud puddles. Lily and Noah were asleep upstairs in their beds, probably dreaming of tomorrow's adventures rather than yesterday's trauma. Ethan was gone, and that would always hurt, but his love remained, transformed into protection and security, and the promise of a better future. He'd given me more than money or property. He'd given me the power to choose my own family, to surround my children with people who would love them rather than use them. Nora had been wrong about so many things, but especially about one. This wasn't about getting what I deserved. This was about making sure my children got what they deserved, a home where they were wanted, a future free from the toxic legacy of people who confused cruelty with strength. Sometimes revenge isn't about hurting the people who hurt you. Sometimes revenge is simply refusing to let them hurt you anymore. Sometimes the best payback is building something beautiful from the ashes they tried to leave you with. As I sat in my garden that night, surrounded by the roses Ethan had planted for me 3 summers ago, I realized that's exactly what I'd done. I'd taken their cruelty and transformed it into strength, their rejection and transformed it into freedom, their attempt to destroy me and transformed it into the foundation of a better life. They thought they were throwing away dead weight. But what they'd actually done was set me free to discover just how strong I really was. And that, I thought, was the best revenge of all.